Lieutenant Sarah Chen had always believed that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but acting despite it. As she crouched behind the crumbling concrete wall in the abandoned warehouse district of Kandahar, Afghanistan, that belief was about to be tested in ways she never imagined. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets as Sarah adjusted her radio headset and checked her watch. It was 06:30 hours, and her reconnaissance team had been in position since before dawn. Their mission was critical but seemingly straightforward. Identify and mark enemy positions for an upcoming airstrike that would clear the way for a major ground offensive. Sarah was 28 years old, a forward air controller with the U.S. Army's 10th Mountain Division. She had grown up in a small farming town in Iowa, where her father taught her that hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle. Those lessons had carried her through the rigorous training required to become one of the few women qualified to call in close air support missions in active combat zones. Her team consisted of 3 other soldiers: Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, her spotter and communications specialist; Corporal James Walker, their medic and demolitions expert; and Private First Class David Kim, their sniper and security. They had worked together for 8 months, building the kind of trust that only comes from shared danger and mutual reliance. The intelligence reports had been clear about the area they were investigating. A significant Taliban force had taken control of a cluster of buildings about 2 kilometers from their current position. The enemy had been using the location to coordinate attacks on coalition supply convoys, and command wanted them eliminated before they could strike again. Sarah's job was to get close enough to visually confirm the targets and provide precise coordinates for the incoming F-16 Fighting Falcons that were already airborne and waiting for her call. It was dangerous work that required her to position herself within sight of the enemy, but it was also essential for ensuring the airstrike would hit the right targets without causing civilian casualties. The team had approached their observation point through a series of abandoned buildings, moving carefully to avoid detection. The area had been heavily contested for months, and both sides had left behind a deadly legacy of improvised explosive devices and booby traps. Every step required careful consideration, and every corner could hide a threat. As they settled into their position, Sarah opened her laptop and began coordinating with the aircraft overhead. The pilots were professional and calm, their voices crackling through her headset as they confirmed their readiness to engage once she provided them with target information. Through her high-powered scope, Sarah could see the enemy compound clearly. She counted at least 15 fighters moving between 3 main buildings, along with several vehicles that appeared to be loaded with weapons and ammunition. The intelligence had been accurate. This was definitely a significant enemy stronghold. Sarah began the methodical process of identifying and marking each target. She used her laser rangefinder to determine exact distances and coordinates, cross-referencing them with her digital maps to ensure accuracy. Each building had to be evaluated, not only for its military value but also for the risk of civilian casualties. It was precise, demanding work that required her complete concentration. Rodriguez monitored their radio communications, while Walker kept watch for any signs that they had been detected. Kim positioned himself to cover their most likely escape route, his rifle ready to engage any threats that might appear. The team worked with the silent efficiency that came from months of training and combat experience. The morning progressed slowly as Sarah continued her reconnaissance. She identified ammunition storage areas, communication equipment, and what appeared to be a command post where several enemy leaders were meeting. Each discovery was carefully documented and transmitted to the aircraft circling overhead. By midday, the temperature had risen to over 40 degrees Celsius, and sweat soaked through their uniforms despite the shade provided by their concrete shelter. The heat made their equipment uncomfortable to handle, and the glare from the sun created additional challenges for Sarah's optical equipment. As she adjusted her position to get a better view of a newly discovered target, Sarah noticed increased activity in the enemy compound. More fighters were arriving, and they appeared to be preparing for some kind of operation. She realized that time was running short. If they didn't act soon, the enemy might disperse, making the airstrike ineffective. Sarah made the decision to move closer to get better target identification. It was risky, but the mission's success depended on having accurate, detailed information about enemy positions. She informed her team of the plan, and they began preparing to advance to a new observation point, approximately 200 meters closer to the target. The new position would put them in a partially collapsed apartment building that offered excellent sight lines to the enemy compound. Intelligence reports suggested the building was abandoned, but Sarah knew that in this environment, no assumptions were safe. They would have to move carefully and be prepared for anything. As the team prepared to move, Sarah felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and anxiety that preceded every dangerous operation. She thought briefly of her family back home, of the letters from her younger sister that always ended with reminders to stay safe. But she also thought of the soldiers who were counting on her to provide them with accurate intelligence, and of the civilians who would be safer once this enemy stronghold was eliminated. The decision to advance would prove to be both the most important and most dangerous choice of Sarah's military career. In a few hours, her courage, training, and determination would be tested beyond anything she had ever experienced. But for now, she focused on the mission ahead, checking her equipment one final time and signaling to her team that it was time to move. The abandoned building awaited them, silent and seemingly empty in the afternoon heat. Neither Sarah nor her team could have known that their next few steps would trigger a chain of events that would transform a routine reconnaissance mission into a desperate fight for survival, and ultimately into one of the most remarkable displays of courage under fire in modern military history. The explosion came without warning, a thunderous roar that seemed to tear the world apart. One moment, Sarah was carefully stepping through the rubble-strewn doorway of the abandoned apartment building, her eyes scanning for threats and her mind focused on the mission ahead. The next moment, the floor beneath her feet erupted in a brilliant flash of orange and white, launching her body through the air like a broken doll. The improvised explosive device had been expertly concealed beneath loose concrete and debris, positioned precisely where advancing soldiers would most likely step. The Taliban fighters who had planted it understood the tactics of American reconnaissance teams, and they had prepared this deadly surprise with patient calculation. Sarah's world became a chaos of sound, light, and sensation. The blast wave hit her like a massive, invisible fist, compressing her lungs and making her ears ring with a high-pitched whine that drowned out all other sounds. She felt herself flying backward, her equipment scattered in all directions, before crashing into a pile of concrete blocks with bone-jarring force. For several seconds, Sarah existed in a strange suspended state between consciousness and unconsciousness. Her vision flickered between sharp clarity and complete darkness, while her mind struggled to process what had happened. She could taste blood in her mouth and smell the acrid smoke of explosives. But the world seemed strangely distant and unreal. Rodriguez was the first to reach her, his voice cutting through the ringing in her ears as he shouted for Walker to bring his medical kit. Through the haze of shock and pain, Sarah could see the concern in Rodriguez's eyes as he knelt beside her, his hands moving quickly to assess her injuries. The damage was immediately apparent and devastating. The explosion had caught Sarah at the worst possible angle, directing most of its force upward through her legs. Both of her lower limbs had been mangled by the blast, with her left leg suffering massive trauma below the knee, and her right leg badly damaged from the ankle to mid-thigh. Walker arrived with his medical kit, his training taking over as he began the systematic process of trauma assessment. His face was grim as he worked, applying tourniquets and pressure bandages while calling out Sarah's vital signs to Rodriguez, who was trying to establish radio contact with their command post. The pain began to break through Sarah's shock like a rising tide of fire. It started as a distant burning sensation but quickly intensified into waves of agony that threatened to overwhelm her consciousness. She gritted her teeth and forced herself to focus, knowing that giving in to the pain would mean abandoning her mission and potentially endangering the lives of countless other soldiers. Kim had taken up a defensive position near the building's entrance, his rifle trained on the approaches while he watched for any sign that the explosion had alerted nearby enemy forces. The blast had been loud enough to hear for kilometers, and he knew that Taliban fighters would likely investigate to determine whether their trap had been successful. As Walker continued his medical treatment, Sarah forced herself to take stock of her situation. She could move her arms and upper body, and her mind was becoming clearer despite the pain. Most importantly, her radio equipment appeared to be intact, though it had been scattered by the blast and would need to be reassembled. The realization hit her with stunning clarity. The airstrike was still scheduled to proceed, and she was the only person in position to guide it accurately. The mission that had brought them here remained critically important, and dozens of American soldiers were depending on the intelligence she was supposed to provide. Rodriguez was speaking urgently into his radio, requesting immediate medical evacuation and reporting their situation to command. But Sarah knew that even if a helicopter could reach them quickly, the evacuation would take time, and the enemy compound might be abandoned by then. The opportunity to eliminate this significant threat might be lost forever. Walker had managed to stabilize her immediate injuries, but his assessment was sobering. Both of Sarah's legs were severely damaged, with multiple fractures and extensive tissue trauma. He had stopped the worst of the bleeding, but she needed immediate surgery and would likely face months of rehabilitation even under the best circumstances. The medic looked directly into Sarah's eyes as he delivered his professional assessment. "Lieutenant, you're badly hurt. We need to get you out of here immediately. You're going to be okay, but you need proper medical treatment right now." Sarah nodded, understanding the severity of her injuries but also acutely aware of the larger situation. Through the damaged wall of the building, she could still see the enemy compound in the distance. The Taliban fighters were continuing their activities, unaware that American forces were preparing to strike. The aircraft were still circling overhead, waiting for her target designations. The weight of responsibility settled on Sarah's shoulders like a physical force. She was the only person present who had the training and equipment necessary to guide the airstrike accurately. Rodriguez and Kim were skilled soldiers, but they lacked her specialized knowledge of close air support procedures. Walker was focused entirely on keeping her alive and stable. As the initial shock of her injuries began to wear off, Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of her life. Despite her devastating wounds, despite the pain that threatened to overwhelm her consciousness, despite the reasonable expectation that she should focus entirely on her own survival, she chose to continue the mission. The enemy compound was approximately 200 meters away, positioned across an open area that offered no cover or concealment. Under normal circumstances, it would be a short walk across relatively easy terrain. But with her legs destroyed and her body racked with pain, those 200 meters might as well have been 200 kilometers. Sarah looked at her scattered equipment, then at the concerned faces of her teammates, and finally toward the distant target that still needed to be marked for destruction. She took a deep breath, tasting blood and dust, and began to formulate a plan that seemed impossible, but might be their only chance of mission success. The next few hours would test every aspect of her training, her determination, and her commitment to the soldiers who were counting on her. But for now, she focused on the immediate challenge of gathering her equipment and beginning what would become one of the most extraordinary displays of courage and dedication in modern military history. Sarah's decision to continue the mission despite her catastrophic injuries seemed to defy logic, but it was driven by a combination of military training, personal determination, and an acute understanding of what was at stake. As she lay among the concrete debris, her legs mangled and useless, she began the methodical process of preparing for what would be the most difficult journey of her life. The first challenge was gathering her scattered equipment. The explosion had thrown her radio, laptop, and laser designator in different directions, and some pieces had been damaged by debris. Using her arms and remaining upper body strength, Sarah began dragging herself across the floor, collecting each essential item and checking its functionality. Rodriguez watched in amazement and growing concern as Sarah refused his attempts to convince her to wait for medical evacuation. "Lieutenant, you can't do this," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "You're hurt too badly. Let us handle the mission." Sarah paused in her equipment gathering and looked directly at her sergeant. Despite the pain that was threatening to overwhelm her consciousness, her voice was steady and determined. "Rodriguez, you know as well as I do that none of you have the training to call in close air support. Those coordinates have to be precise or we risk hitting civilians or missing the target entirely. The mission continues." Walker had completed his initial medical treatment, but he remained deeply concerned about Sarah's condition. The tourniquets and pressure bandages had controlled the immediate bleeding, but she was undoubtedly in shock and facing significant blood loss. Every moment of delay increased the risk to her life. As Sarah tested her radio equipment, She was relieved to find that most of it remained functional despite the explosion. The laptop had a cracked screen but was still operational, and the laser designator appeared to be working properly. Her GPS unit was intact, and most importantly, she could still communicate with the aircraft circling overhead. Kim continued his watch at the building's entrance, but he was increasingly worried about their exposure. The explosion had certainly been heard by enemy forces in the area, and it was only a matter of time before they came to investigate. The team was in a precarious position, trapped in a partially destroyed building with limited escape routes and a severely wounded team leader. Sarah completed her equipment check and began the agonizing process of organizing everything she would need for the journey ahead. She created a makeshift sling from her equipment straps, allowing her to carry her essential gear while keeping her hands free for movement. Every adjustment required careful thought, as she would have no opportunity to reorganize once she began crawling. The pain in her legs had evolved from sharp, stabbing sensations to a constant burning agony that made concentration difficult. But Sarah had learned during her military training to compartmentalize pain and focus on the task at hand. She employed breathing techniques and mental exercises that had been drilled into her during survival training, pushing the pain to the background of her consciousness. Before beginning her journey, Sarah took a moment to study the route she would need to travel. The 200 meters to the optimal observation point would take her across the building's interior, through a large hole in the exterior wall, and then across an exposed courtyard before reaching another damaged structure that would provide the necessary sight lines to the enemy compound. The first segment of the journey would be the most protected, as she would remain inside the building where concrete walls provided some shelter from observation, but the middle section would leave her completely exposed to enemy fire, and the final approach would require her to navigate through more debris and potentially unstable structures. Sarah began her crawl by pulling herself forward, with her arms while using her elbows and shoulders to maintain stability. The movement sent waves of pain through her damaged legs, but she gritted her teeth and continued. Each forward movement was measured in inches rather than feet, as she had to carefully drag her equipment along while avoiding further injury to her legs. The floor of the building was littered with broken concrete, twisted metal, and shards of glass that made every movement treacherous. Sarah found herself having to navigate around larger pieces of debris, while being careful not to cut herself on the smaller fragments. Her uniform quickly became torn and dirty, and her arms began to show scrapes and cuts from the rough surface. Rodriguez made one final attempt to convince Sarah to abandon her plan. "Lieutenant, please reconsider. We can call for another forward air controller to be brought in. This is too dangerous." Sarah paused in her movement and looked back at her sergeant. Despite the pain and exhaustion that was already setting in, her voice remained firm. "Rodriguez, you know how long it would take to get another FAC into position. By then, the target will be gone and this whole operation will have been for nothing. We've lost too many good soldiers to let this opportunity slip away." The psychological challenge of the crawl was almost as difficult as the physical one. Sarah had to maintain focus on her ultimate goal while dealing with the immediate reality of her situation. Every few feet of progress required tremendous effort, and she knew she had nearly 200 meters still to travel. As she continued forward, Sarah began to develop a rhythm for her movement. She would pull herself forward for several feet, then pause to rest and reassess her route. During these brief stops, she checked her equipment and monitored the radio traffic between her team and the aircraft overhead. The pilots were beginning to express concern about fuel levels and the duration of their holding pattern. They needed target coordinates soon, or they would be forced to return to base for refueling, potentially missing the opportunity to strike the enemy compound while the fighters were still present. Sarah could hear the stress in Rodriguez's voice as he communicated with command about their situation. The explosion had compromised their position, and enemy forces were likely moving to investigate. Time was running out in multiple ways, and the pressure to complete the mission was intensifying. Despite the overwhelming challenges she faced, Sarah found strength in her military training and personal convictions. She thought about the soldiers who were depending on accurate intelligence, about the civilians who would be safer once the enemy compound was destroyed, and about her own refusal to accept defeat even in the face of seemingly impossible odds. Each foot of progress was a victory. Each successful navigation around an obstacle was an achievement, and each moment that she maintained consciousness and focus was a testament to her determination. The journey that lay ahead would test every aspect of her character, but Sarah Chen had already demonstrated that she possessed the courage and resolve necessary to attempt the impossible. 50 meters into her journey, Sarah's arms were already burning with fatigue, and her breathing had become labored from the combination of pain, exertion, and stress. Each forward movement required her to brace against the floor with her forearms and drag her entire body weight forward, while carefully managing her equipment and avoiding further injury to her legs. The physical challenges were compounded by the deteriorating conditions around her. The afternoon sun was beating down through the damaged roof, raising the temperature inside the building to nearly unbearable levels. Dust from the explosion continued to hang in the air, making breathing difficult and coating her equipment with a fine layer of grit. As Sarah paused to catch her breath and wipe sweat from her eyes, her mind drifted back to her basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia. She remembered the endless hours of physical conditioning, the grueling obstacle courses, and the survival exercises that had seemed so difficult at the time. Her drill sergeant, a tough woman named Staff Sergeant Martinez, had constantly pushed her recruits beyond what they thought were their limits. "Chen," Martinez had shouted during one particularly brutal training exercise. "When you think you can't go any further, when every muscle in your body is screaming for you to quit, that's when you find out what you're really made of. The enemy won't care if you're tired or hurt or scared. They'll only care if you complete your mission." Those words echoed in Sarah's mind now as she forced herself to continue forward. The training that had once seemed impossibly demanding now appeared almost easy, compared to her current situation. But the lessons she had learned about pushing through pain and exhaustion were serving her well in this moment of ultimate testing. The route through the building was becoming more treacherous as Sarah encountered areas where the floor had been weakened by the explosion. She had to test each section carefully before putting her full weight on it, concerned that additional collapse might trap her or cause further injuries. The delays were frustrating, but caution was essential for mission success. At the 75-meter mark, Sarah reached the large hole in the exterior wall that would take her outside and into the exposed courtyard. Before leaving the relative safety of the building, she took a moment to assess the situation outside and plan her route across the open ground. The courtyard was approximately 50 meters wide, covered with loose gravel and scattered debris from previous fighting in the area. There was no cover or concealment available, which meant that once she began crossing, she would be completely vulnerable to observation and enemy fire. The thought was terrifying, but Sarah knew there was no alternative route available. As she prepared to leave the building, Sarah's radio crackled with updates from the aircraft overhead. The pilots were reporting increased activity in the enemy compound, with vehicles arriving and fighters moving equipment between buildings. It appeared that the Taliban forces were preparing for some kind of operation, which made the timing of the airstrike even more critical. Rodriguez's voice came through her earpiece, filled with concern and barely controlled emotion. "Lieutenant, we're getting reports of enemy movement in your direction. You need to know that there may be hostile forces approaching your position." Sarah acknowledged the information but continued with her preparations. The risk was increasing with every passing minute, but turning back now would mean abandoning the mission and potentially allowing a significant enemy force to escape destruction. The stakes were too high for her to consider retreat. Before entering the courtyard, Sarah took a moment to think about her family back home in Iowa. She pictured her parents' farm, with its neat rows of corn stretching toward the horizon, and remembered the sense of peace and security she had always felt there. Her father had taught her that farming required patience, persistence, and the willingness to work through difficult conditions to achieve long-term goals. "Sometimes the weather doesn't cooperate," he had told her during one particularly challenging harvest season. "Sometimes the equipment breaks down, and sometimes it seems like everything is working against you. But if you keep working steadily toward your goal, if you don't let setbacks defeat you, you'll eventually succeed." Sarah smiled grimly as she remembered those words. Her current situation was certainly not what her father had in mind when he shared that wisdom, but the principle remained the same. Steady progress toward a clear goal, regardless of the obstacles encountered along the way. The transition from the building to the courtyard required careful maneuvering through the rubble-filled opening in the wall. Sarah had to lower herself down approximately 3 feet, while managing her equipment and avoiding further damage to her legs. The process was exhausting and painful, but she successfully navigated the obstacle and found herself on the gravel surface of the courtyard. The open ground presented new challenges that Sarah hadn't fully anticipated. The loose gravel made it difficult to get proper traction with her arms, and the surface was more uncomfortable against her body than the concrete floor had been. Additionally, the complete lack of cover made her feel psychologically vulnerable in a way that was almost as difficult as the physical challenges. Sarah had advanced approximately 10 meters into the courtyard when she heard the distant sound of vehicles approaching. Through the haze of pain and exhaustion, she recognized the distinctive engine noise of Taliban motorcycles and pickup trucks. The enemy forces were indeed investigating the explosion, and they were getting closer to her position. The situation had suddenly become much more dangerous. Sarah was completely exposed in the middle of the courtyard, unable to move quickly and carrying equipment that would immediately identify her as an American soldier if she were discovered. Kim's voice came through her radio, confirming her worst fears. "Lieutenant, we have multiple enemy vehicles approaching from the east. At least 6 fighters on motorcycles, plus what looks like a technical with a mounted weapon. They're maybe 5 minutes out from your location." Sarah felt a moment of pure terror as she realized the full implications of her situation. But rather than paralyzing her, the fear seemed to focus her mind and energize her body. She had come too far and endured too much to give up now. The mission had to be completed regardless of the personal cost. Drawing on reserves of strength and determination that she didn't know she possessed, Sarah increased her pace across the courtyard. Each forward movement became an act of defiance against the pain, the fear, and the seemingly impossible odds she faced. Her arms burned with exertion, her legs screamed with agony, and her lungs struggled to provide enough oxygen, but she continued forward with grim determination. The sound of approaching vehicles grew louder, and Sarah knew that her window of opportunity was rapidly closing. In a few minutes, the area would be swarming with enemy fighters, and her chance to complete the mission would be lost forever. But she also knew that she was closer to her goal than she had been since the explosion, and giving up now would mean that all of her suffering had been for nothing. With the sound of enemy vehicles growing closer and her strength nearly exhausted, Sarah pushed herself across the final meters of the exposed courtyard with desperate determination. Her arms were shaking from fatigue, and each movement forward required a conscious act of will. But the target building was now within reach. The structure she was approaching had once been a small shop or office building, but repeated explosions and gunfire had reduced it to a skeletal framework of concrete and twisted metal. Most importantly for Sarah's mission, it offered multiple vantage points with clear sight lines to the enemy compound, while providing some protection from observation and return fire. As Sarah reached the base of the damaged building, she could hear the motorcycle engines growing distinctly louder. Kim's voice crackled through her radio with increasing urgency, reporting that the enemy vehicles were now less than 2 minutes away from the courtyard she had just crossed. Time was running out in every possible way. Sarah forced herself to focus on the immediate challenge of getting into position for the airstrike. She identified a partially collapsed section of the building's interior, where fallen concrete slabs had created a natural observation platform approximately 6 feet above ground level. From that position, she would have an unobstructed view of the target compound and adequate protection from small arms. Fire. The climb to the observation position required Sarah to use every technique she had learned. During her military training, she created anchor points with her equipment straps, used the building's damaged reinforcement bars as handholds, and employed pure upper body strength to pull herself upward. Each foot of vertical progress was agonizing, but she could see her goal clearly now. As Sarah reached the observation platform and arranged her equipment, she could finally see the enemy compound with perfect clarity. Through her scope, she counted at least 25 Taliban fighters moving between the buildings, along with several vehicles that were clearly loaded with weapons and ammunition. The intelligence had been accurate. This was a significant enemy stronghold that posed a serious threat to coalition forces. Sarah opened her laptop and began the rapid process of acquiring precise target coordinates. Her training took over as she methodically identified each building, measured distances with her laser rangefinder, and cross-referenced the information with her digital maps. Despite her injuries and the deteriorating tactical situation, her hands moved with practiced efficiency across the equipment. The first motorcycle engine sounds became audible from the courtyard below, and Sarah knew that enemy fighters were now investigating the area where she had been just minutes earlier. She could hear voices shouting in Pashto as the Taliban scouts examined the blast site and searched for signs of American forces. Sarah's radio crackled as she established contact with the lead aircraft overhead. The pilot's voice was calm and professional, but she could detect an undercurrent of concern about the mission's duration and complexity. Reaper 1-1, this is Falcon 2-4. We have you on radio, ready to receive target coordinates and begin attack run. Despite the chaos around her and the pain that threatened to cloud her thinking, Sarah's voice was steady as she began transmitting the critical information. Falcon 2-4, this is Reaper 1-1. I have multiple confirmed enemy positions. Stand by for 9-line brief. The 9-line brief was a standardized format for communicating target information to attacking aircraft, and Sarah had practiced it hundreds of times during training. But never before had the stakes been so high or the conditions so challenging. As she began transmitting the data, enemy fighters were literally searching for her position just meters below. Initial point, Grid 41, Romeo Papa Uniform, 12345-67890, heading 270 degrees. Distance 3.2 kilometers. Target elevation 455 feet above sea level. Target description: 3-story concrete building, white exterior walls, red tile roof. Enemy personnel and vehicles visible. Sarah continued through the brief, providing detailed information about each target building, the locations of enemy personnel, and the positions of civilian structures that needed to be avoided. Her training and experience allowed her to maintain focus despite the increasingly dangerous situation developing around her position. Below her, the enemy search was intensifying. She could hear fighters moving through the building beneath her observation point, their voices becoming more excited as they discovered evidence of recent American presence. It was only a matter of time before they located her position. But Sarah continued transmitting target data with unwavering concentration. The pilot acknowledged each piece of information and requested confirmation of several critical details. The precision required for close air support meant that even small errors could result in mission failure or civilian casualties, so every coordinate had to be verified and double-checked. Reaper 1-1, confirmed target building is the 3-story white structure with vehicles in the courtyard area. Falcon 2-4, that is affirmative. I have visual confirmation of multiple enemy personnel moving between vehicles. I count at least 15 fighters with small arms and what appears to be crew-served weapons. As Sarah provided the final targeting information, she heard footsteps on the concrete rubble below her position. The enemy fighters had entered the building and were beginning to search the upper levels. Her concealment would be discovered within minutes, but the airstrike was finally ready to begin. Reaper 1-1, this is Falcon 2-4. We have good copy on all target information. We are beginning our attack run now. Time on target 60 seconds. Recommend you take cover and prepare for immediate effects. Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction and relief as she realized that her mission was about to succeed. Despite her devastating injuries, despite the impossible odds, despite the approaching enemy forces, she had managed to provide the pilots with everything they needed to eliminate the target. The sacrifice and suffering had been worth it, but the danger was far from over. Sarah needed to remain in position to observe the strike results and provide damage assessment, while simultaneously avoiding detection by the enemy fighters, who were now just feet away from her location. She carefully arranged her equipment to minimize its visibility and prepared for what would be the most intense 60 seconds of her life. The sound of jet engines grew louder as the F-16s began their attack run, while voices below indicated that the enemy search was closing in on her position. In less than a minute, the building would be shaken by massive explosions, and Sarah would learn whether her extraordinary effort had achieved its intended result. She gripped her radio tightly and prepared to guide the aircraft through any necessary adjustments to their attack. The mission was almost complete, but the most dangerous moments still lay ahead. The first F-16 screamed overhead at what seemed like impossibly low altitude, its engines creating a deafening roar that echoed off the concrete walls around Sarah's position. She pressed herself against the rubble, feeling the building shake from the aircraft's passage, while maintaining visual contact with the target compound through her scope. Seconds later, the first bomb struck the main enemy building with devastating precision. The explosion was far more powerful than Sarah had anticipated, sending a massive fireball skyward and creating a shockwave that she could feel in her chest, even from 200 meters away. The white concrete structure simply disintegrated under the impact, disappearing in a cloud of dust and debris. Sarah immediately began providing battle damage assessment to the aircraft overhead, her trained eye cataloging the destruction while her voice remained calm and professional, despite the chaos surrounding her. Falcon 2-4, this is Reaper 1-1. Direct hit on primary target. Building is completely destroyed. I can confirm secondary explosions from stored ammunition. The second aircraft began its attack run as Sarah continued her assessment. Through her scope, she could see enemy fighters running frantically from the compound, some carrying wounded comrades while others abandoned vehicles and equipment in their desperate flight. The psychological impact of the sudden devastating attack was as effective as the physical destruction. Below Sarah's position, the enemy fighters who had been searching for her were thrown into confusion by the nearby explosions. She could hear them shouting orders and questions in Pashto, their voices filled with panic and uncertainty. The search for American forces was temporarily abandoned, as they tried to understand what was happening to their comrades across the courtyard. The second bomb struck the ammunition storage building with equally devastating results. The explosion was even larger than the first, creating a spectacular fireball that rose hundreds of feet into the air. The secondary explosions continued for several minutes as stored ordnance cooked off, sending tracers and fragments in all directions. Sarah watched through her scope as the enemy compound was systematically destroyed. Years of accumulated weapons, equipment, and supplies were being eliminated in a matter of minutes. But more importantly, a significant enemy force that had been responsible for numerous attacks on coalition convoys was being neutralized. Falcon 2-4. Second target is destroyed. Massive secondary explosions confirm significant ammunition storage. I count at least 20 enemy personnel fleeing the area on foot and in vehicles. The third and final bomb was directed at the communications building where Sarah had earlier observed what appeared to be enemy leadership meetings. The precision-guided munition struck exactly on target, eliminating the Taliban command structure and destroying their ability to coordinate further operations in the region. As the dust began to settle over the destroyed compound, Sarah felt a profound sense of accomplishment. Despite her catastrophic injuries, despite the impossible odds, despite the approaching enemy forces, she had successfully completed her mission. The intelligence she had provided had enabled a perfectly executed airstrike that eliminated a significant threat to American and coalition forces. But her situation remained extremely dangerous. The explosions had intensified the search efforts of the enemy fighters below her position, and several of them were now climbing toward the upper levels of the building where she was hidden. Sarah knew that discovery was imminent, and that she lacked the physical ability to escape or defend herself effectively. Rodriguez's voice crackled through her radio with urgent concern. "Lieutenant, we can see enemy fighters in your building. You need to get out of there immediately. We're coming to extract you." Sarah keyed her radio, knowing that her team was too far away to reach her before the enemy fighters found her position. Rodriguez negative on the extraction attempt. Too many hostiles in the area. Complete the primary mission and get yourselves out safely. Kim's voice joined the radio conversation, filled with determination and loyalty. "Lieutenant, we're not leaving you behind. Hold your position. We're coming for you." As Sarah prepared for what might be her final radio transmission, the situation suddenly changed dramatically. The helicopter that had been dispatched for medical evacuation had been redirected to provide close air support after monitoring the radio traffic about her dangerous situation. The Apache attack helicopter appeared over the courtyard, like an avenging angel, its 30mm chain gun chattering as it engaged the enemy fighters who had been searching for Sarah. The psychological impact was immediate and decisive. The remaining Taliban forces abandoned their search and fled the area as rapidly as possible. Within minutes, the area around Sarah's position was secure, and the Apache pilot was coordinating with her team for immediate extraction. The medical evacuation helicopter was also inbound, with a full surgical team prepared to provide emergency treatment. Rodriguez, Walker, and Kim reached Sarah's position just as the rescue helicopter was landing in the courtyard. Despite her protests that she could wait for a proper stretcher, they carefully moved her to the observation platform's edge and prepared to lower her to ground level using improvised rope. techniques. The extraction process was challenging due to Sarah's injuries and the unstable nature of the damaged building, but her team's training and determination ensured that she was safely transferred to the waiting medical team. As the helicopter lifted off and began its flight to the nearest surgical facility, Sarah allowed herself to finally acknowledge the magnitude of what she had accomplished. Through the helicopter's window, she could see the smoking ruins of the enemy compound that had been destroyed through her efforts. The intelligence reports would later confirm that the airstrike had eliminated more than 30 Taliban fighters, destroyed a significant weapons cache, and disrupted enemy operations throughout the region for months. Dr. Amanda Foster, the flight surgeon aboard the helicopter, worked quickly to stabilize Sarah's injuries during the flight to the field hospital. Her assessment was sobering but hopeful. The damage to Sarah's legs was severe, and she would require multiple surgeries and extensive rehabilitation, but her life was no longer in immediate danger. As the morphine began to dull the pain that had been her constant companion for the past several hours, Sarah reflected on the events that had transformed a routine reconnaissance mission into one of the most remarkable displays of courage and determination in recent military history. She had faced the ultimate test of her training, her character and her commitment to her fellow soldiers, and she had not been found wanting. The helicopter flew steadily toward the medical facility where a team of specialists was already preparing for her arrival. Behind them, the ruins of the enemy compound continued to smolder, a testament to the effectiveness of American military precision and the extraordinary courage of those who guide it. 6 months after the explosion that shattered her legs and changed her life forever, Lieutenant Sarah Chen sat in the rehabilitation center at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, methodically working through her physical therapy exercises. The journey from that dusty courtyard in Afghanistan to this modern medical facility had been marked by pain, determination, and gradual but steady progress. The surgical procedures had been more extensive than initially anticipated. Dr. Michael Harrison, the orthopedic surgeon who had led her treatment team, had been forced to perform 7 separate operations to reconstruct the damage to her legs. The left leg had required a complex series of bone grafts and metal implants, while the right leg had undergone extensive soft tissue reconstruction and nerve repair. Sarah's physical therapist, Maria Santos, had become both a trusted ally and a demanding taskmaster during the long months of rehabilitation. The process of learning to walk again had been humbling for someone who had once prided herself on her physical fitness and military bearing. But Sarah approached it with the same determination that had carried her across that courtyard in Afghanistan. "Remember, Lieutenant," Maria would say during their daily sessions, "every step forward is a victory. You're not competing with who you were before. You're becoming someone new, someone stronger in ways that can't be measured by how fast you can run or how far you can march." The medals and commendations had arrived during her recovery, but Sarah felt ambivalent about the recognition. The Distinguished Service Cross, the Bronze Star with Valor, and the Purple Heart were meaningful honors, but they seemed to belong to a different person from the one who was now struggling to walk down a hospital hallway without assistance. What mattered more to Sarah were the letters and visits from soldiers, whose lives had been affected by her actions that day. The convoy that had been planning to use the route near the destroyed Taliban compound had avoided a carefully planned ambush. The intelligence gathered from the airstrike had led to the disruption of a broader enemy network throughout the region. Sergeant Rodriguez visited frequently during her recovery, bringing updates about their unit and news from Afghanistan. He had been promoted and was now training new forward air controllers, sharing lessons learned from their mission and emphasizing the importance of never giving up in the face of seemingly impossible odds. "You know, Lieutenant," Rodriguez said during one of his visits, "what you did that day changed how we think about courage. It's not just about being fearless in the moment. It's about making the choice to continue when every logical reason tells you to quit." Walker and Kim had also visited, and Sarah was pleased to learn that both had been recognized for their actions during the mission. Walker's medical treatment had undoubtedly saved her life, while Kim's security and Rodriguez's communications had enabled the successful completion of the operation. The psychological aspects of recovery had been as challenging as the physical rehabilitation. Sarah worked with Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a counselor who specialized in combat trauma, to process the emotional impact of her experience. The conversations helped her understand that survival guilt and adjustment difficulties were normal responses to extraordinary circumstances. "You made a choice that saved lives," Dr. Martinez explained during one of their sessions. "The fact that you survived to deal with the consequences doesn't diminish the value of that choice. If anything, it gives you the opportunity to continue making a difference in ways you haven't even discovered yet." As Sarah's physical condition improved, she began considering her future options. The medical board had determined that she would not be able to return to active duty in her previous capacity, but several alternatives were being explored. The Army had offered her a position in training and doctrine development, where her experience could benefit future generations of soldiers. The possibility of remaining in the military in a different role appealed to Sarah, but she was also considering civilian options. Several defense contractors had expressed interest in her expertise, and there were opportunities in consulting and training that would allow her to continue contributing to military effectiveness. What surprised Sarah most about her recovery was how the experience had changed her perspective on strength and resilience. The physical challenges that had once seemed so important now seemed less significant than the mental and emotional qualities that had enabled her to complete her mission under impossible circumstances. 9 months after the explosion, Sarah took her first unassisted steps outside the hospital. The prosthetics and reconstructed bones would never allow her to return to her previous level of physical activity. But she could walk, she could stand for extended periods, and most importantly, she could continue to serve in ways that utilized her knowledge and experience. The ceremony marking her transition from patient to outpatient was attended by her family, her former teammates, and several of the medical personnel who had participated in her care. As she walked across the room without assistance, Sarah felt a sense of accomplishment that rivaled what she had experienced during the most challenging moments of her military career. Dr. Harrison, who had overseen her medical treatment from the beginning, spoke to the assembled group about the remarkable nature of Sarah's recovery. "In 30 years of orthopedic surgery, I have rarely seen a patient demonstrate such determination and resilience. Lieutenant Chen's recovery is a testament to the power of the human spirit when combined with excellent medical care and unwavering support from family and friends. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came in a letter from the commanding general of coalition forces in Afghanistan. The intelligence gathered from the airstrike that Sarah had directed had contributed to the disruption of enemy operations throughout the region. The ripple effects of her actions that day had saved countless lives and significantly improved security for both military personnel and Afghan civilians. As Sarah prepared to begin the next chapter of her life, she reflected on the lessons learned during her journey from injury to recovery. The explosion had taken away her leg's normal function, but it had revealed reserves of strength and determination that she hadn't known she possessed. The girl from Iowa who had joined the military to serve her country had become a woman who understood that true courage wasn't the absence of fear or pain, but the willingness to continue moving forward despite both. The 200 meters she had crawled across that Afghan courtyard had become a metaphor for every challenge that life might present in the future. Sarah, Chen's story would become part of military training curricula, studied by future generations of soldiers as an example of dedication to mission and commitment to fellow service members. But for Sarah herself, it was simply the foundation for whatever came next. A reminder that with determination, support, and the right perspective, seemingly impossible obstacles could be overcome.